I'm Jordan and welcome to Andalusia Knits. This is my YouTube channel where I talk about knitting and yarn and all things fiber. And today I've got a video where I am going to be talking about some of the slightly embarrassing rookie mistakes that I made as a beginning knitter. And I'm doing this in the hopes that some of you won't go down the same stupid paths that I went down when I started out knitting. And for those of you who have gone down these same stupid paths, hopefully we are able to commiserate a little bit about how ignorant we were in our early days of knitting. And so I've been knitting for about 6 or 7 years now. I started right before the pandemic, which was unfortunately and fortunately a great time to pick up a new solitary hobby. And in those 6 years, you know, I would by no means say that I am an advanced expert knitter by now, but I have learned a thing or two, and I have definitely changed up a thing or two since I started out as a beginning knitter. And so I want to talk about some of those things that I have left in the past. Mostly. Some of these mistakes may or may not haunt me a little bit to this day. But before we get to that, if you like knitting videos like this, if you like knitting content like this, I would encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss an upload from me. And with that, I think it is time to get started with some of my slightly embarrassing rookie mistakes as a beginner knitter. All right, so the first rookie mistake I want to talk about is probably the most annoying one I've encountered, and it's one that I know I'm not the only person to deal with this. I know I'm not the first person to have this hubristic thought that I do not need a yarn winder and a Swift. And so if you're like me, when you started out your knitting journey, you were getting your supplies from like the big box craft stores like Michael's and Joann and Hobby Lobby and those sorts of places. And when you buy yarn from there, typically it is ready to go just as it is. So you will encounter a lot of balls of yarn where there's like a center pull ball and you just yoink and it's ready to knit. Or you'll find balls of yarn like this where you got a loose end on the outside that's ready to knit, ready to go. And so for a long time I didn't, like the world of ball winders did not even exist to me because I had no reason to think about it. But if you knit long enough, eventually you're going to run into yarn that is sold wound up like this. And we call this a hank of yarn. And it's a very cute, very aesthetic way to display yarn and stuff. But it comes with a little problem, and that problem is, so this is the hank all twisted up, and when you untwist the hank, you see that in reality it's just a big loop of yarn. And this is where things get interesting. This is where you start needing a ball winder. And my first thought was that I don't need a ball winder for this. I'm just going to be very careful, be very delicate, and just nicely and gently lay this to my side when it's time to knit. And I'm just going to pull from the loop and, you know, work around the loop, and everything will be fine. And like, even if you are super duper careful, it's never going to stay untwisted. Like, so the kiss of death is when, you know, some strands from one side of the loop migrate over to the other side of the loop. And right now you can see there are some ties in this yarn that are preventing them from migrating over there. But to actually use the yarn, you have to cut those ties. And once you cut those ties, all bets are off, like in terms of keeping this untangled. Like, it's not going to happen. I know you think you're going to be the first person to successfully knit from an unwound hank and not get it tangled up, but it's not going to happen. And when it does happen, you're going to probably be like me, and you're going to be left with a ball of yarn that has to be untangled. And it took me, the one time I made this mistake, the one time I did not use a ball winder when I needed to, it took me a good like 6 to 8 hours to get the yarn untangled and into a ball. And so just save yourself the heartache and bite the bullet and go and get a ball winder and a Swift. And these, you don't have to like spend top of the line money on this sort of thing. So my ball winder that I've got it right here. And believe it or not, I bought this thing on Amazon like 5 or 6 years ago. This was one of my earliest knitting purchases because, like I said, I learned real quick after one tangled mess that I absolutely need a ball winder. But I bought this on Amazon for probably like $40, like 5 or 6 years ago. And this thing is in suspiciously good condition for a cheap Amazon product that I bought. I don't think I've ever had another Amazon product last me years before, but this thing, despite it's got some, like heavy duty metal on the base, but like all of the gears and stuff inside of this winder, they're all just plastic, and it looks like they might even be 3D printed. But the quality on this thing, it has lasted me 5 or 6 years, and I would expect it to last another 5 or 6 years as well because it's just like this. The setup is just so simple that it's kind of hard to mess it up, I think. But yeah, so go out and get yourself a ball winder before you end up with a tangled mess like I do. Because, like I said, if you want to work with hanks of yarn, it's kind of like a non-negotiable. There are some like low-tech, cheaper ways of winding this without a ball winder, but you're still going to have to do something. You're not ever going to be able to just like take this yarn in a big loop and knit from it. Something is going to have to be wound onto something. And my suggestion is to just go out and get a good, reliable, and affordable ball winder and not worry about it anymore. Up next, we have a rookie mistake that I used to make that is quite hubristic in terms of yarn choices. And that is this idea of if I don't like the yarn, if the yarn failed in this project, then it's a bad yarn. And that is simply not true. It took me a very long time to wrap my head around this idea that there's not I mean there are some legitimately just like bad quality badly spun yarns out there, but a lot of what people might typically consider a bad yarn is more a case of it's not being matched up to an appropriate project. And so I would do things like be like, oh, I've got this acrylic yarn and it just made the itchiest, worst sweater ever. Or, oh, I've got this light, loosely spun, woolen spun yarn and I made a pair of socks out of it and they fell apart immediately. This is a bad yarn. And both of those cases have happened to me, and in both cases, that is simply incorrect. It's not that the yarns were bad, it's that I was trying to use fibers and spinning types that were just not well suited to the projects I wanted to do. And so I had to learn a bit about like the different fibers and what they're well suited for. And once I started doing that, like all of these dumb fiber choices that I was making started to go away. I started to enjoy the yarns I liked a lot more. So for example, like once I stopped trying to knit sweaters out of acrylic yarn, it didn't seem as bad. Once I started trying to make home goods out of acrylic yarn, it started to seem like a much more reasonable yarn type. And once I learned about like the different ways of spinning yarn, like woolen versus worsted, it made sense why that pair of socks with the loosely spun yarn just fell apart, immediately upon wearing. It's because I didn't choose the right yarn for the right job. And so this is one of those things where like even if you don't like actively like pursue, an education in like the different types of fiber and what projects those are well suited for, as you knit, you'll start to develop that sort of knowledge through trial and error. But that being said, it never hurts to like take a peek. It never hurts to do a quick Google search every once in a while of like, what sorts of projects are acrylic yarn good for? What sorts of projects are wool yarn good for? That sort of thing, like maybe like taking a look at what other people have to say, because otherwise there is a good chance that you will end up with a project where you have just completely mismatched the type of yarn with the purpose that you're going for, and it's just not going to work out. It's going to lead to a very disappointing project. And My next rookie mistake has to do with swatching, but it's not what you think. It's not an issue of, oh, I hated doing gauge swatches, and so all my projects ended up the wrong size. For whatever reason, like that trade off of doing a little bit of extra work at the beginning, knitting the swatch, in order to ensure that all of the hours of work that you do on the actual project fits, that trade off like always made sense to me. I never really struggled in terms of like not wanting to knit a gauge swatch. For whatever reason, that like always seemed logical and reasonable to me. But the thing I didn't know and I didn't realize for so long is that like swatches are so much more useful than just like figuring out what your gauge is in a particular yarn. Swatches are the perfect way of like figuring out a new technique before you have to like do it within the context of an actual project where it's probably going to be more stressful and more intense for you. So it's one of those things that every time I had to learn a new technique, and when you're a beginning knitter, maybe every single project you're doing, you're learning new techniques. I would just like practice them as I encountered them in the project. And if things didn't go well in the project, then that was usually a pretty stressful, unpleasant time for myself. What is really great about doing test swatches like this, and what has really helped me like grow my skills as a knitter, is that doing these test swatches before you get to the real thing, in some scenarios can allow you to ramp up the difficulty slowly. So as you get better at the technique, you can make things more and more challenging until you're doing the real thing. And so this would show up in something like, let's say that you're knitting a sweater and you're going to knit it it's knit in a fingering weight yarn, and the yarn is a very dark color, and it's kind of like a fuzzy halo-y yarn without a lot of great stitch definition. And you've got to mattress stitch these sweater panels together. That particular combination of characteristics in yarn is like, you cannot choose a more challenging way to learn how to do mattress stitch. And so with doing these test swatches, you can ramp up the difficulty. So like if you've never done mattress stitch, let's say this first swatch, you're going to do it in a worsted weight yarn, and it's going to be a light color, and it's going to be in a yarn that is really slick and smooth and has a lot of crisp stitch definition. So you can see exactly where the yarn is going to go as you're doing the mattress stitch. And then after you got that under your belt, you can do a second swatch where now, okay, I'm going to do it in fingering weight yarn like the real project, but I'm still going to do it in this yarn that has a crisp, clear stitch definition. And then finally, you like ramp up to the real thing where you're doing the mattress stitch in the project with the yarn that is too challenging, or that was too challenging at the beginning. But now at this point, you've done several mattress stitch swatches in varying degrees of difficulty, so you kind of slowly, gradually worked your way up to that point. Whereas if I had just started with the mattress stitch in the less than ideal yarn, it would just like make me angry and frustrated immediately. But now I've got that experience under my belt where it's not as much of a hassle and a headache when I get to the real thing. And so nowadays whenever I am doing a pattern and there's a technique that I'm not familiar with, or when I'm doing a design and I'm trying a technique I've never done before, you better believe I'm absolutely doing at least 2 or 3 test swatches, sort of ramping up the difficulty of like learning and wrapping my head around that particular technique. What is So next, I want to talk about the rookie mistake that has probably wasted the most of my time, even more so than not buying the yarn winder and having the tangled mess that I had to fix. And that is this like my ignorance of like learning how to fix my mistakes. For a long time when I was knitting, like making a mistake meant that I had to start over. And obviously that was a very like anger inducing thing in me. I hated making mistakes because a mistake meant that all of my hard work was going to have to be obliterated. Because for whatever reason, I was very resistant to learning techniques about how to fix my mistakes. And I don't know why that was, beyond like fear of doing it wrong. But even then, like even if I tried to fix my mistakes and I did it wrong, I'm going to have to rip out everything anyways, which was what I was going to do in the first place. So why not give a try to fixing your mistakes, and maybe you don't have to rip out everything. But for whatever reason, yeah, I was very resistant to learning things about like how to tink, how to run a lifeline, how to ladder down and fix mistakes that have happened, way back. But those are all very essential things. And if you're a beginning knitter, like I would really encourage you to learn some techniques for fixing your mistakes as soon as possible. It's not something that you want to put off. I feel like if I had started sooner with learning to fix my mistakes, it would have saved me a lot of like heartache, a lot of like projects chucked across the room in anger, because making mistakes doesn't have to equal like total annihilation in knitting. It's actually quite easy once you wrap your head around the techniques. It's actually quite painless and easy to fix those mistakes. So this one is just like a plea and a warning to beginning knitters. Like if you don't know how to tink, if you don't know how to ladder down, if you don't know how to run a lifeline through your work, I would encourage you like to learn how to do that as soon as possible, because you're going to save so much time. You're going to save so many good stitches that you don't need to undo and unravel if you can learn to fix the stitches that are messed up. So the last mistake I want to talk about is one that's not necessarily a rookie mistake. This is one that still plagues me and that I still feel a little sad about sometimes. And that is this mistaken idea that no matter what sort of like knitting issue you encounter, there will always be some sort of workaround or some sort of elegant solution to the problem I'm having. And while that is true some of the time, that is not always the case. And I think the reason that I fall into this trap of believing that is because, like, in terms of knitting, like we've never had it easier. There has never been such a like wealth, such a glut of information about knitting as there is currently, in the modern era. Whether it's like, on the internet, books, video tutorials, there is just so much information we have at our fingertips available to us in terms of like learning cool knitting things. And so after a while, after, like Google search after Google search of like getting successful hits for like techniques and ways to do things, you start to just get habituated that there's always going to be an answer. There's always going to be an easy way to like do what you're trying to do. And at least in my case, I have found that you run up to, you hit a wall eventually with that mindset. There are just, some things that like you want the knitting to do that it's just never going to do, because the yarn has to obey the laws of physics just like the rest of us. So for example, like for the last couple of months, I've been trying to be on this like left-leaning decrease quest where I find one that is identically, clean and nice and neat to the knit two together to the right-leaning decreases. And at this point, I am just like forced to say I'm never going to find that mythical left-leaning decrease that looks just as good as a knit two together, because it doesn't exist. Because like the way the needles have to move through the yarn it's never going to happen. The left-leaning decrease is never going to be as nice as the right-leaning decrease. And so, yeah, that's one of those things that I bump up into sometimes, and it's very frustrating. So, and in a similar vein, there are times when I will find solutions to a knitting problem that I have, but they seem really convoluted and tedious, and I don't want to do it. And I'm sure there's an elegant solution out there. And that is definitely not the case either. And that's not so much like me running into like the laws of physics in yarn. It's more like a matter of like being lazy. I want the easy way out. But sometimes the easy way out is still quite convoluted and challenging. And so it's a mistake that like I definitely felt it more as a beginner. As a beginner, I was absolutely more reluctant to do things that I thought would be slow going. And that's not the case as much anymore, but that's still like a temptation to say, oh no, that's way too much work. It's not worth the effort. But sometimes, if that's your only option, then maybe it should be worth the effort. So, as an example of this, I have a cowl I've been working on. This is Andrea Mowry's Ooey Gooey cowl, and I have all of the knitting done, and it's done in this blue clay yarn. Love the results, by the way. That's not what this is about, though. But the final step of this pattern is to take the top end of the cowl and graft it to the bottom end of the cowl. And so the cowl started with a provisional cast on in this blue yarn right here. And when it came time to undo the provisional cast on, I wasn't necessarily expecting, like, I knew boucle was going to be a real pain to work with, but I had a hope in the back of my mind that I was going to start undoing this provisional cast on and it was just going to unravel as easily as it does every other time. And that is not the case. Like, the boucle yarn is just very like split and wrapped around the provisional cast on in ways that is preventing it from unraveling smoothly. And so like for a month I've been like, I've been trying to find the easy, elegant solution. I'm like, maybe a lot of people talk about boucle is easier to work with when it's cold, so put it in the freezer. It's like, maybe this time, maybe this 10th time that I put it in the freezer, it will make the unraveling of the provisional cast on a breeze. And that's never been the case, and it's not ever going to be the case, because the boucle is, just like I said, is just all split and wrapped around the provisional cast on in ways that's preventing it from unraveling. And so for me, like, the easy way out is going to be like manually unpicking this thing one by one. And so once again, like, I'm not a beginner, but I'm very reluctant to do that because even as a more advanced knitter, I'm still kind of looking for the easy way out sometime. And unfortunately, the easy way out does not always exist. And I think that this is one of those times. All right, I think that is going to do it in terms of me confessing my mistakes. I'm tired of telling you all the ways that I used to be a bad knitter, but thank you for watching. Hopefully you got something out of this. Hopefully you will learn from my mistakes and not make the same ones that I did. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more from me, I would encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that you are never out of the loop when I upload a new video. And it's also a great way to let me and YouTube know what kinds of videos you'd like to see from me. So I think that's going to do it for today. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!